This lecture is about Alfred Adler, one of the more interesting theorists we'll be working with. So let's get started. So Alfred Adler was Austrian. You can see that that's nearby Freud. He was a compatriot living at the same time as Freud, around the same age. And in his personal life, he was second son in a financially comfortable family, 4 boys, 2 girls, so kind of a middle kid. Health was a big issue in his life because he had a condition that made it really difficult for him to walk and move around, and he ended up being wrapped in bandages a lot with that condition called rickets. And in fact, his earliest memory came from when he was around 2 years old, when he could recall himself being bandaged up, sitting on a park bench, unable to move beside his healthy older brother. And that kind of thing fostered a lot of his views of people. He also had an experience at the age of 5, hearing a doctor tell his dad that he would die. And he also had the tragic experience of having his younger brother die in bed when they were sharing the same bed. So illness not uncommon in that time, but he had it pretty close up, which led him to decide to become a doctor to prevent death and fear of death. And he had a particular interest in children and focused his work as a doctor on children with difficulties or delinquent children. And he really thought parenting was important for creating the style of life that would foster healthy engagement. He opposed punishment. He preferred listening and respecting the child and creativity. Along this line, but not mentioned, he really did believe in equality of the sexes in a way that was quite uncommon in his time. So we'll note then that he was a colleague, not a student of Freud, and in fact, he kind of went in a different direction from Freud. And he's considered to be the father of individual psychology because he absolutely respected the rights and power of the individual to forge and create their own lives. So Adler has 3 key themes that we'll be discussing in this lecture. There are more that you'll read about. The first of these is striving for significance, which he says is a primary motivation for all human beings, not limited by culture or anything like that, and that we become significant, have impact, meaning we're noticed, we feel real by comparing ourselves with others in many, many different areas, even small areas of our lives, and especially as children. And these experiences usually manifest as either felt plus, meaning we compare and we find ourselves good enough or even better than others, but also felt minus experiences where we're not as good as others. And these can lead to complexes, inferiority or superiority complexes that can impact our actions and perceptions in the rest of our lives. Theme 2 is that we're shaped by development, that parenting and birth order significantly shape our processes that we use to strive for significance. And finally, that we do have a unified personality, and that is determined by fictional finalism, which is sort of a sense of where we envision ourselves, and style of life, a creative choice that we make about how we approach the world, and that these are the source of personality that makes us as coherent, unified individuals. They're like the stories that we tell ourselves that we believe and that eventually become ourselves. So a question that we can discuss is, in what areas do we compare ourselves with others, and whether these comparisons are beneficial or detrimental? And this is a question for you to think about that we will discuss when we get to a group setting. So as we strive towards superiority or significance, they might seem like 2 different things. We're often doing these first exercises in the context of people who are older and more mature than us, like our parents, for example, or like our siblings, especially if they're older siblings. And so this is a fundamental motive. It's that we make never-ending efforts in some way to be better, superior, significant, to have our presence be felt. So once again, these begin in our sibling relationships. So that's why he has an emphasis on birth order as being important in the formation of a person. And that these comparisons, as briefly described earlier, result in these felt minus experiences where we're worse than others. I myself had many felt minus experiences with my sense of direction. My older sister especially had an outstanding sense of direction, and my own was so weak. And so now there's a story that I tell myself about myself, that is that I have a poor sense of direction through these felt minus experiences as a child. Felt plus experiences are those in which we're better than others. And so ways that we distinguish ourselves as unique and have something to offer that's, people would come to us for because we're better at it. And so we tend to accumulate these experiences, like maybe a lot of felt minus experiences, which can lead to this inferiority complex, or a lot of felt plus experiences where we're better, which can also lead to could lead to a superiority complex, which is an inferiority complex in disguise, or sort of a sense of narcissism. And so we need to have kind of a balance of these, and we need to reconcile the areas in which we have felt minus experiences. By our parents can help a lot in talking through such experiences. But we need to reconcile them. And if we don't, they become the foundation for these like lifelong complexes. And a lot of times we'll see that siblings in these comparison situations where they are having felt minus just by their very nature because they're smaller and younger, can go in two directions. Either sibling de-identification. If your sibling is just outstanding in music, maybe you stay away from music and choose, writing or something different to focus your skills on. Or else, if you're both in the same domain, same area, then you have maybe a healthy or maybe an unhealthy sibling rivalry where you compete in the same domain. And I did have some little video up here of the Manning brothers. They're football players who were in a football family and all pretty darn proficient, and probably good sibling rivalry helped them all to master their skills. So Adler did distinguish between striving for personal superiority versus striving for success of everybody. So both are goals, but they have really different outcomes. So people, as we described on the previous slide, people striving for personal superiority are often compensating for feelings of inferiority. They tend to view others as opponents, and if someone else does well, they tend to experience that as like decremental to the self, even if it's someone else that they love, someone in their own family. So there's like a competitive perspective with everybody around them. And they might appear to serve others, but even in that service role, personal superiority is still the objective. So it might work like it would depend on what's valued by the community. And so if benevolence and service is well regarded in the community and people who serve kind of get respected, then a person who is striving for personal superiority might seem to serve others and be benevolent, but in fact they're really serving themselves, compensating for that feeling of inferiority. On the other hand, striving for success is considered a motivation of social interest in the success of all humankind. So unlike the first person, a person who's motivated in this way isn't struggling with those feelings of inferiority and is tending to view others as collaborators and friends. And therefore, when one of these other people is successful, this person feels as much joy on behalf of that person. They don't feel threatened by another person's success. They can celebrate that other person's success because everyone is viewed as collaborators. And so when they're looking at problems, they tend to take the view of what's best for society in mind. And if they work toward a good end toward society, they don't need to be recognized or to have personal credit for it. So that we have both kinds of striving for superiority, but one is that ego boosting, that always overcompensating for inferiority, and the other is more broad-minded with an outward focus. In fact, we'll see throughout Adler's work that this outward focus on the betterment of society through your good work and service in the community, through your ability to be a friend and to have complete faith in those around you, and your ability to have intimate relations in your family, and in a long-term partnership, he viewed all of these as just essential. And to obtain them, he said there's got to be an outward focus. If we have this inward focus, if we look outward and see only a reflection of ourselves, he says that bodes poorly for one's healthy style of life. So because of this, birth order becomes important, and he identifies the firstborn child as the pacemaker. When they begin life, firstborn children get the full attention of the parents. They are the focus. Everything they do seems like a miracle, and they, probably become accustomed to that sort of attention. And once they're dethroned by a second-born child, that may bring out a sense of jealousy, insecurity, and maybe they kind of turn to take over a parental role, like act like a parent to the siblings, bossing them around. And as adults, they tend to overvalue authority, according to Adler's view, meaning that they really, people should always obey the rules, and the same in the home, and their younger siblings should obey them. They tend to have more conservative values rather than liberal, and we can think about this in political terms, but also just conservative in terms of spending and in behaviors, not to be too out there. And they tend to have more nostalgia, like longing for the past. If there's anyone who's going to get the family reunions together or keep the old photos up, or, it might be the firstborn, according to Adler. The second-born child is most thought of to be envious. They might tend to have a feeling that they're always slighted. Maybe in this day, not quite as many pictures of them, and their older sibling always is doing things first and better. And the second-born tends not to be spoiled or pampered, depending on the age difference, of course. We'll talk about the research behind this after the end. And rebellion is part of that second-born characteristics. They step away from those conservative values. They step away from the nostalgia and the deep family traditions as a way of finding their own path. The youngest child tends to be what he calls diffuse, meaning maybe, they're babied a bit by their older siblings and they don't strive too much to be independent. Ahead of them, they have too many pacemakers. They have the firstborn paving the way initially, the secondborn paving a different direction as a rebel, too much competition, and so they might be like unfocused, not very directed toward a goal, not sure of how they can distinguish themselves or find significance. And finally, if there's an only child who never had siblings, and this is assuming a nuclear family, which is not typical in traditional Navajo ways, a nuclear family meaning father, mother, and kids living in one home. So in that context, an only child becomes too self-involved, maybe too attached to the mother, pampered a little bit, and thinking more of themselves than is realistic, an unrealistic sense of self-worth. Now, the actual research into birth order effects is just it's just too loose. The reason birth order is very hard to study is because families themselves have all kinds of different frameworks and nuances, and it's just too hard to generalize. So, what about the age difference between the children? It's hard to put that into the equation. What about step families or different family structures? One-parent family versus two-parent families. Those kind of variations may not have been as present during Adler's time, so maybe he felt more justified in studying it. And a lot of times when I ask my students, they do find that these sort of stereotypical characteristics fit them. But in any case, the research itself is difficult to do because of the complexity of families and birth order. So what is an inferiority complex? We can see in this image over here someone who seems to have this kind of complex. I doubt they would want me around. Did I do okay? Why can't I be better? I'll never be good enough. They're just telling me what I want to hear. And the thing about an inferiority complex is it's a feeling of being unworthy that crosses many situations. So defined as associations that lead one to feel less than others in many situations and through many triggers. So this feeling of inferiority, this word triggers is here, this feeling of inferiority, it can like permeate a person, and many, many little things will set it off, and it can lead to a sort of a giving up. And so we all have felt minus experiences sometimes. That's pretty normal, and feel that we're not good enough. Sometimes that can even be beneficial, making us work harder. It is a complex when it's pervasive and hinders what a person can do. It gets in the way. It permeates everything they try to do, this feeling of not being good enough. And so it can result, if someone has too many experiences of felt minus, that they can't overcome them. And maybe they had no one to help them, guide them through that story of being not good enough through those experiences. Then the child's brain doesn't know what to do with it except assume the truth of those experiences. And it can lead to a loss of striving and a sense of stagnation, like not putting effort forward, because if you don't believe you're good enough, then the idea of putting forth effort, why would you? Because you have this whole complex view of yourself as unworthy. And the person who has this complex, they're not making stuff up. They really do believe that that's accurate, that they aren't good enough, that other people really are better, even though, of course, we know that whatever we work at, we improve at. And so it's an unfortunate belief that Adler challenges very much. So that is the inferiority complex. It can result from, like, he himself had an inferiority complex because of his health, because of having rickets, and he thought that was a huge influence on his life. But it can also come from family dynamics, like, maybe an older sister who never gets lost, and, or just society placing demands on a person, forcing people to compete when they're not ready for that competition or when it's inappropriate. A superiority complex, interestingly, isn't a person feeling better than others. On the contrary, it's actually an inferiority complex that leads someone to act superior, to conceal what they're unaware of, their own feelings of inferiority. So this one is kind of complex. So a given is that everyone sometimes feels inferior. But if you're led to believe that feeling inferior is something to be ashamed of, a sign of weakness, then it might lead a person to try and hide that feeling. Because being inferior is one thing, but seeing these feelings of inferiority as a sign of weakness might lead a person to act in certain ways. All right? They want to repress, put down those felt minus experiences. They try to, but they still feel inferior. So then they consciously say that they're superior. It's sort of like a sour grapes effect in Freudian theory. Well, I'm better than that anyhow, And through that acting of superiority, they might believe their own story. Actually believe that one really is better than others, doesn't have to bother with it. But Adler contends that this is, in fact, inferiority masked. And so a person who has a superiority complex might have vacillating feelings, going from feeling inferior to feeling superior. That self-doubt might arise again, and then they override it with that superiority kind of action. So these are bad responses to felt minus experiences. So I have just phased in this text here, but I want you to think about someone who, like, maybe doesn't even want to bother with you because, they're too good for you. They know more about it than you do. Well, I don't want to talk to you about politics because, you're not up to my standards. You can maybe envision that person who's acting that way as actually having a fear of not knowing something and being made to feel inferior, which causes them to step back in this pretense of superiority. All right, so it's like a denial of one's sometimes inferiority that we all naturally have to have. And in both cases, inferiority or superiority, they both impede one's upward striving, one's desire to improve oneself and do better. The person with the inferiority complex just gives up. They don't believe they can do it. The person with the superiority complex already thinks they know it, and they're too good to do that kind of hard work. So in both cases, they really interfere with a healthy life path. So just looking at healthy and unhealthy development then, neurosis is an outdated term, but it was present back in the time many of these theorists were writing. We'll see this like in Horney and a couple of the others. And so it's just like a way of thinking about the world that's considered to be unhealthy, like an over-worried, too self-focused, all of that. So first off, in the neurotic and unhealthy view, one might have an inferiority or a superiority complex, and that would happen if these felt minus experiences permeate life. But in the normal healthy, an individual also will have feelings of inferiority, but they don't impair growth. Someone help them navigate these feelings, and navigate this striving. So in a neurotic state, an individual stops trying to improve, either because they're too good for it already or they don't think they can do it. But a normal person keeps striving to do better, to improve themselves all the time. In a neurotic state, someone protects themselves against failure by what we call self-handicapping. That is, if one is worried about failing, then they set themselves up with some obstacles, like they go out partying the night before a test if they're worried about taking the test, because then if they do poorly, they can say, oh, well, I was out partying, or they actually were out partying, and they can say, oh, that's why I blew that test. Right? Or through passivity, just not taking any action, feigning indifference. But the individual has the courage to be imperfect in what he would say a healthy state, knows and accepts their own imperfection. And this neurotic development stems from comparison with others in the absence of good role models, parents and teachers and even siblings who teach them how to deal with felt minus experiences that we all necessarily have to experience. And of course, the normal gets encouragement and instruction in how to persist and cooperate despite downfalls. And someone talks to them about how to manage those natural failures that we all experience. A second theme of Adler relates to parenting. So Adler doesn't allow us room for excuses, but he does observe that development is impacted by how one is parented. And a person might have more to overcome if the parenting supported unhealthy styles of life. So one thing that can happen is a pampered child, what he terms a pampered child, a child that's overindulged and given all of what they need and allowed to slack their responsibilities, that sort of thing. And such a child, he says, will grow up to be someone who expects others to cater to them. They won't really be able to find love because they'll always be looking to have their own needs met. They won't be able to give love. Neglected child is another problem that can arise, and that's people like orphans who have lost their parents or children who are unwanted. And this can lead to certain styles of life that might almost seem to relate to attachment disorders. So, for example, a child who is neglected might lead to sort of an avoidant style of life where they never step into relationships but avoid them and keep to themselves and don't allow themselves to trust other people. And as I mentioned in parentheses, this is like an anxious avoidant attachment style. Notice that word style, which comes to this idea of choice. A neglected child could also sort of become preoccupied. They could just always seek to be pampered by other people, like they didn't have that pampering, so they're always, if they get in relationships, they're always like needy in those relationships, and they have a great need to be cared for in a way that really takes too much of a toll on other people. And so both of these, he would say, are a result of parenting, and they are both unhealthy styles of life. So maladjustment and safeguarding are a consequence of these challenging styles of life resulting from parenting. So maladjustment, as Adler defines it, means an underdeveloped social interest. The focus is inward on the self and on the self's need rather than on the needs of outsiders or on others. And people who he would define as neurotic, but that's not a word we generally use anymore, but nevertheless it reflects this kind of maladjustment. They tend to set goals that are really high. They need to prove that they're not just average. Like being average would be a downfall, would not be acceptable. They have to be better than. Their private world tends to predominate, meaning they look outward, but they only see a reflection of the self. And this might be evidence in things like if they see someone else who is in a bad kind of a state, they would tend to think, oh, what did I do to cause that? That's the kind of like hyper focus that even when they're looking at someone else's pain, they're still seeing a reflection of themselves. And they tend to live this really rigid life then that's really dictated by these unrealistic goals, always focused on the goal of proving oneself. And so in order to protect this terribly fragile ego, people in this position tend to safeguard. They have to protect that fragile ego that's not functioning in the world. And they do this, in Adler's view, consciously, engaging in patterns of behavior to protect that self-esteem. The examples we have, I'm not sure there's evidence of consciousness, but that's nevertheless Adler's position, that everything we do is from our own choice, and that if we are engaging in these behaviors, they're conscious. You can't fend them off as just consequences of your life situation. And so he identifies 3 ways that people safeguard. The first is excuses. The second is aggression. And the third is withdrawal. So let's look at each of these 3 ways separately. So excuses are just explanations for our failure to meet our goals, our failure to persist, our failure to achieve, our failure, our mediocre life status, all of that. And they tend to fall in 2 categories, yes, but, or if only statements. Yes, but statements. You sort of agree with the statement, but then you explain why it's not true. Yes, I'd like to be an author very much, but my job takes too much of my time. Or yes, I'd love to have traveled, but I just never saw it as a realistic possibility, so it just didn't happen. You could make that statement in a way that's not safeguarding. You could just be looking at it and saying realistically, yeah, this is why I didn't travel. But if you're doing it to justify, like, well, I would have been like that, but I just never, wasn't raised in such a way. If you're doing it to protect your ego, that's different from just explaining why it happened. And the second excuse type thing is if only statements, same kind of thing really, but slightly different. It's sort of a longing, if only I'd been raised in a scientific family, I could have made great discoveries. Or if only I'd grown up in a time when women had rights, I could have been a strong leader. So once again, we're like blaming. We're like making excuses for why we haven't done more. And the question that Adler would probably ask is, what if you don't make the excuse? What if you stop saying, if only I'd been raised in a scientific family, and you just start doing science? What's the risk, he might ask. And so if you think about that, if you take away the if only part of it, then you have someone who could make great discoveries. And what is the first step in making great discoveries? It's taking a chance. And every chance comes with the possibility of failure and rejection, which is difficult for someone who is fragile, as described in these examples. A second form of safeguarding is aggression, actions designed to cause others to suffer. And deprecation is one way that we do this. It means we undervalue what someone else achieves and overvalue one's own achievements. And so through the eyes of this person, what other people do really isn't very good, and their own achievements are better. But we can see this as a fragile attempt to protect the ego. Gossip, talking badly about others, belittling others, criticizing others. All of these are often like ways of putting others down in order to boost the self. Oh, they only like him or her because she or he's an easy teacher. Belittling another's accomplishments. Accusation is blaming one's failures on others. Oh, my relationships are lousy because my father just didn't love me enough. My husband was so unreliable. That's why the family fell apart. Sort of if you're the victim, and other people's actions are what cause you to be as you are. Self-accusation, and this one might give you a turn, but it's often thought that sort of low self-esteem, criticizing oneself, is just the same as thinking too much of oneself. And self-accusation is like belittling oneself. A lot of guilt or self-torture, or, oh, I was just the lousiest friend, all of this sort of thing. I didn't know enough about parenting when my children were young, and now look at the challenges I've created for them. I'm such a lousy friend. I just don't know how to love properly. And so now if you think about these statements, it seems like the belittlement of the self, but now think about the listener. If we direct our attention outward, what is the response to that kind of statement that this person is making? This is making the listener feel lousy. It's making the listener suffer. I mean, think how it would feel, if a mom said this to her kids, I just didn't know enough, and now look what I've done to you, right? Then the kid is compelled to reassure the parent. I'm such a lousy friend. I just don't know how to love. The friend is now compelled to reassure this person. And so you can see the unstated goal, even in self-accusation, of wanting others to suffer in order to build the self. This is Adler's position. And the third safe-gathering technique is withdrawal, so escaping life's problems by just creating distance between yourself and others. And he would talk about a few different ways that we do this. Moving backwards, kind of like the regression and Freudian theory, we retreat back to the safe kind of place of our youth. Maybe returning to our home or returning to some of those comforts that we have, comfort foods, comfort places. It's good to relax, but not as a way of protecting the ego. He would also say standing still, just sort of freezing in place, not moving in any direction, just staying in the status quo. Well, that does serve a purpose. It eliminates the possibility of failure, but it also eliminates the possibility of success. It's just inaction. Hesitating, this is a tough one. It's like this vacillating. You're not sure which way to go. You don't make a decision, and you put it off for so long that the opportunity passes. Well, it's too late now for me to go to med school, So, and then finally, constructing obstacles, creating barriers to one's own achievement, kind of like self-handicapping. So maybe you've created an illusion of yourself as a good student and you want to nourish this. This is your narrative. And so if you don't do well on the exam, you might violate your narrative. So you go out partying the night before the big exam so you can say, well, I would have aced it, but man, I was so tired. Or failing to get a babysitter in front of an important job interview. You just didn't do that. And so what happens? Well, you're distracted and unfocused during the interview, and later on, if someone asks you if you got the job, you can say, "Oh no, I didn't get a babysitter. I couldn't find a babysitter. If I'd had that interview and the kids weren't there, I'm sure I would have gotten it. But the situation was too rough." And so all of these are related, he would say, to these unhealthy styles of life, stemming from never managing to deal with the fault-minus experiences in a competitive world. So in his great way, a deep love for children and wanting them to grow up healthy that Adler had, he has some advice that's translated through this Druckers and Souls paper. And for example, he suggests that one should not punish a child, that a child should always be encouraged, not punished for wrongdoing, that children mostly need to learn. that parents can be firm, but not dominating the child, not dictating everything that the child says and does and seeks to experience. And respect the child like a fellow human being who he might say is just walking on the same path, just not quite as far, and just as worthy of respect. To maintain routines, to have a nice, safe set of routines in the home that the child can depend on and feel safe in, and to emphasize cooperation over competition, doing things together rather than proving that one is the best. Not over-attending to the child, like if the child is setting on a task or with a sibling, that, they're allowed to find their way through the difficulties on the task. Avoiding power struggles, like avoiding getting into a battle where you say it's my way or, the highway, and the child tantrums and we have a big battle. Avoid them and use skill and language to investigate like the reasons for a child's wish and need, and be firm. If you must set a boundary, be firm, but don't get into this kind of battle. Use your actions to show what should be done, not telling the child what to do, but showing. So showing your love by the ways you treat the child, but also showing how a person navigates the world, showing how a person deals with felt minus experiences by dealing with your own in front of the child. Don't offer excessive sympathy if the child does have a felt minus experience. Well, this isn't life-threatening. This is just a human experience. And so it doesn't mean that we don't have compassion or that we're inconsiderate of the child, of the emotion that the child has. But if we offer too much sympathy, that suggests that there really is something there that is pitiful. And we don't want to communicate that, because felt minus experiences are for part of everyday life. And then to be consistent, to be as consistent as possible in yourself so that you could be consistent for the child.